welcome. I am Mark Anthony Neal, Chair of the Department of African and African American Studies, and we'd like to welcome you to the first lecture of our 50th anniversary lecture series. This is the 50th year since the launch of the department in the academic year 1969-1970. And so we thought we'd take an opportunity to celebrate folks who have come through Duke University's campus, who have been touched by our department, by folks who are here or have gone on to other institutions, and by bringing those folks back to give a glimpse into the future of what Black studies might look like in the next 50 years. Our first guest tonight, of course, is Ashon Crawley. Next month, on October the 14th, it'll be Professor Courtney Baker. On November the 11th, it would be Professor Patrick Alexander. And then on December 4th, it will be Professor Kanohi Nishikawa. So please check all your social media platforms to find out more information about these specific lecturers. Our guest tonight is Associate Professor of Religious Studies and African American Studies at the University of Virginia. He's the author of Blackpentecostal Breath, The Aesthetics of Possibility, which was published by Fordham University Press, an investigation of aesthetics and performance as modes of collective social imagination, which Roderick A. Ferguson describes as a one-of-a-kind intervention into performance, religious, Black, and cultural studies. Professor Crawley is also the author of The Lonely Letters, an exploration of the interrelation of Blackness, mysticism, quantum mechanics, and love, to be published by Duke University Press in 2020. He is currently working on a third book, tentatively titled Made Instrument, about the role of the Hammond organ in the institutional and historic Black church, in Black sacred practice, and in Black social life more broadly. All of his work is about otherwise possibility, and I believe his lecture this evening is from that third project. Right. Professor Ashon Crawley.
Hi, everybody. It's a complete joy and honor to be here. I came here in 2008, student, kind of didn't know what I wanted to do, and am returning 11 years later, having graduated, taught at 2 universities, currently teaching at the second one, and having a good time. And my foundation at Duke is what made all of that possible, and so it's really just a joy to be back with you all. It's a joy to share with you all some of the work that I've been doing. And I think of this talk, I'm gonna ask for a preacherly thing. Could I have a napkin? Because I am gonna start sweating. Like, I'm already hot. I'm thinking of this lecture as a kind of, what has Ashon been up to since he left Duke University in 2013? And so the talk is going to jump a little bit. And the very last part of the talk is going to jump to some of the augmented reality, 3D design stuff that I've been trying to do, which I think is deeply a part of the concepts of Black Pentecostalism that I was trying to work through. But I'm going to get there through talking about the Hammond organ. But before I begin, obviously I want to thank Professor Mark Anthony Neal for the invitation, for the kindness and generosity, for even being here, and to Tyra Dixon for answering that frantic email at about 3:30 p.m. that said, I need a laptop because my iPad isn't working. And so thank you for the logistics and all the help that you've done, and for the laptop too. It's nice to be back. And it's good to see people from my committee here too. It's really a joy. This is called Migration Stories in the Sound of the Hammond Organ. Okay. Or it's called The Motion of Sound in Withdrawal, which is a play on Sam Delaney's A Motion of Light and Water. It's a talk in a lot of parts, so sorry. Number 1. And isn't it strange that there is an ongoing tension between practice as thought, that sometimes is movement, and the thing we call philosophy and theology and history and ethics and epistemology of life? Is it strange that there is a gap? I would not call it merely hypocritical, but a deep structure of feeling that informs and deforms theology, philosophy, history, ethics, epistemology, as the anoriginal incoherence from which possibility enfleshes itself as action. Such enfleshment happens in space-time, not necessarily in linear fashion, but in fits and starts, in the practice of alternative when-wheres of the then-theirs. It is a strange sense of feeling. It's a strange sense of feeling one receives when one attempts to convey what has been carried. Strange insofar as the thing called the normative world would have attempted to have such conveyance, such carrying, be an impossibility. But such possibility was the underside of the practice of racial capitalism, the existence that resists previous to situation, before the object was objectified, a form of life that is an original. And this is joyous and the occasion for pleasure. Being made instrument is the practice of this strangeness, an interruptive force against the possibility of sovereignty, against its desire of realization. And this because being made instrument is desired in the service of being conduit, of being vessel, for one's otherwise than the individual. It is to make oneself into a plural event in the service of plurality. It is a poetics, and it is a form of anesthetic encounter.
Absolutely. There is no other God beside you. It's in you that we live and move and have our being. You have called us from all parts of the earth. And more importantly, all parts of the body of Christ. To witness and celebrate choice and elevation. Father, we have been summoned by you, which is such an esteemed privilege to be here. Name by name and rank by rank. We say yes, Lord. Father, we thank you for your son that is getting ready to be prince in your life. Gracious and holy Father, stretch out your hand. Lay pillars in his being. Substantiate your selection. Anoint your call.
It is about the sound of the Hammond organ. What the instrument plays, this nothing music, this practice of nothing sensed as sound and otherwise than song, is the concern for life, the concern for existence. What the instrument plays out is the concern for abandonment and being left alone. It plays out of a situation after having had some very real experience that was otherwise worlds of possibility enacted and erupting into the normative space-time, a chronoticism based on the concept of chronos and temporality, of expanded and dilated space-time against linearity that cannot be sustained. And if a chromaticism is the adding of color to scale, chronoticism would be the adding of temporal expansion or decrease to and thus against linear movement. I think one thing people get wrong about Blackpentecostalism is the point. It appears that perhaps too many think that the point of the practice is for shouting or dancing in the spirit to happen. I think it's the reason why there are so many Instagram pages dedicated to and so many videos on YouTube that feature praise breaks. But this seems to be an imprecision because it seems to me to be the case that the point of Black Pentecostal movement is the moment after praise, when the music is still playing softly, that the musician carries them so that they don't feel abandoned after such a deeply emotional and fleshly exchange has taken place. I think people feel something viscerally that they enjoy, but feel they won't be carried and held beyond that moment. It's a kind of fear of abandonment. But can we celebrate this musicianship and what it seems to do and to carry. The instrument being with, its sounding out during the church service, during and after it, its hum and buzz, presenting itself is the announcement of this concern. It is heard before the church service begins. It is heard during the prayer and the testimony and song, during announcements and the offering, before and during the priest moment, during the altar call and after benediction. The Hammond organ is heard, it vibrates out as relation to existence, to what it means to breathe. And there's something about when the bass pedaling is announced, when it emerges, how it is sensed and felt. It is like adding a mode of caress, of cultivation, which to say it carried as it carries. It is a kind of sonic support, a sounding out scaffolding and foundation upon which the structure of vibration will make its meaning most pronounced. It is care that is constantly on the move. It is care that is migrating. This talk, which is from the larger project, Made Instrument, is a query into the affective life of the musician and the space in which such an entity, a vessel, an instrument finds itself, oneself. This project is an attempt to place the genealogy of Hammond musicianship in a Black queer lineage of motion, migration, and diaspora. I expand upon the concepts in Blackpentecostal breath to consider the ways life in and as Blackness is about the practice of breath and breathing, a practice that honors Black queer vitality, that doctrine and theology attempt to misremember, sever, and forget. Doctrine and theology will function in this project as consistent with what Nick Mitchell says of disciplines and curricula of the university. Doctrine and theology create the objects, the persons, it seeks to denounce and renunciate relation to. It creates the objects and the persons it attempts to misremember and to forget. Clyde Wood offers the following, quote, "Both the Black church and the blues emerged in rural areas where Black political and economic institutions were subjected to constant surveillance and often destroyed. Both prospered in southern cities and spread throughout the northern and western diasporas. With its theology of liberation and common metaphorical language, the church helped move the social, cultural, economic, and human rights goals forward while giving institutional and physical form to the African American vision of the ideal community and utopia," end quote. I argue that the transition to doctrine and theology from and through the relinquishing of metaphor and imagination, we find the problem of racial thought that comes with the dismissal and diminution of working class Black social life, and that in the service of becoming normative. And unlike Blackpentecostal breath, Made Instrument is a much more trenchant critique that emerges by attending to doctrine and theology and how it is consistent with post-emancipation, Jim Crow, post-Great Depression laws that segregated housing and public education, that created crises in public health with infectious disease, and created the concept of sexual perversion in the space of cities in order to regulate racialized, gendered, and sexed peoples. The Hammond organ as a cultural object in Black social life gives us an accounting for the sounding out of these cities. The doctrinal, theological, juridical, economic, educational, and medical help to create the objects that it denounces, and all in the service of the constitution of a people as surplus that has to be controlled and maintained for the possibility of exploitation, wage theft, and violence. The church finds affinity with law, economy, and the medical, educational, the latter becoming expressions on and of the doctrinal theological expressions that create a kind of harmony of Western constructions of personhood. What I'm trying to say, stated plainly, is that laws and practices of the political economy and education end up finding justification in doctrinal and theological sentiments that the Black church is continually seeking relation to. This to say that the Black church might be considered, instead of an institution, a set of propositions, a set of entanglements, enfleshments, tensions, disagreements, and this might be felt and practiced in the gathering of vibration as sound and song in the Hammond organ. In Made Instrument, I will use, for example, sodomy laws, vagrancy laws, and prostitution laws to think about life in a postbellum city. In Made Instrument, I aim to say that though Black religiosity might evince a different epistemology of operation, the different epistemology does not necessarily name an epistemology that we should desire or valorize. It just names the fact that difference, which is to say alternatives to the normative, do exist. It is to charge our imagination for the possibility of possibility. We should celebrate the fact of the possibility for alternatives while also being critical of what those alternatives might themselves present in terms of flourishing or delimitation of breathing. The Black church is a space in which deep listening as a practice of collectivity happens. This space privileges what Jennifer Stover calls the listener, the way, quote, sound communicates truth, end quote, about Black life that is about the fundamental vibrations of existence, a tradition in which sight and light do not produce knowledge necessarily for Black subjects' survival, but rather sound and darkness. So more, this project is going to ask with force and intentionality, how has Black queerness as a choreosonic sacred practice and mode of relationality been made instrument? How has Black queerness been instrumentalized in Black culture? This project is an extension of and a critique of my own work, Blackpentecostal Breath. Some things I got wrong and I have to try to attend to. What if we think of the organization of vibration as sound and song as occasions for the performance of that tension? What if we consider the organized vibration to be interventions into and thus against doctrinal and theological impositions, not only or ever primarily at the level of lyricism, but at the level of sound as location, what I call here geosonic possibility, the enunciation and elaboration of difference and dissidence. Geosonic possibility allows for a thinking with difference that attends to relation and distance without succumbing to ideas of deficiency and discardability. Chicago sound from, say, the Brooklyn sound might offer us a way to think about the organizing that celebrates difference as a fact of life, of breath and breathing, played out on the Hammond organ. Section 2. A gesture. In the poem In Lovely Blue, Friedrich Holdren begins with the following. In lovely blue blooms the steeple with its metal roof. Around the roof swirls the swallow's cry, surrounded by most touching blue. End quote. It is a minuscule moment, a quick happening in a very long poem. But the way the phrase ends by most touching blue is for me a turnaround, like a Hammond musician. It is inventional. Blue blooms against the roof swirls against most touching blue. It's like the phrase says what it says, but twice. That the content of the idea that blue is lovely and one can be in it is repeated, but with difference. I call this repetition with difference the turnaround. The turnaround is the core structure of that Hammond musicians use with how they end phrases between lines, between choruses and verses, and between verses. The turnaround is the place where invention happens, but the practice does not belong to the one musician, but to the plural. What is marked between musicians, in other words, is relation. What is accomplished in Lovely Blue is a turnaround and reminds me of the inventive possibility of questioning that Hammond musicians are constantly posing to congregations. This order of thinking is not natural, but emerges from an epistemology of feeling, from a group sociality. It reminds me of the fact that dance and play are in the turnaround, the choreosonic space of improvisation, improvisational drive and verve. It marks the same with difference. What was originally titled Les mots et les choses, sorry for the French, y'all, Words and Things, was rendered in English as The Order of Knowledge, written by Michel Foucault. And The Order of Knowledge was chosen precisely because the former, Les mots et les choses, Words and Things, was the name of two books already in French, and the publisher wanted to avoid confusion. But the avoidance was about the interpretation of thought as opposed to translation. It was about the movement of thought with the attempt to maintain the same quality of the unoriginal phrase. It was a search through the sonic public for something that was quite literally the same with difference. It was an intentional marking of difference that might be considered to be the inventional possibility of the Hammond musician. In two versions of the same essay, Fred Moten begins the essay Taste, Dissonance, Flavor, Escape, a preface for a solo for Miles Davis, Fred Moten opens with the following. In version 1, to speak from the position of the not supposed to speak is to submit to an even more fundamental disqualification, that in speaking from that position, one relinquishes the possibility of thought or of being thought, insofar as one merely provides the material conditions for another's thought and for another's being thought. In the second version, which is in the book Black and Blur of that same essay, he begins with this. To speak when and where one is not supposed to speak is to resist an even more fundamental disqualification, that such spatio-temporally disruptive enunciation relinquishes the possibility of thought or of being thought, insofar as one merely provides the material conditions for another's thought and for another's being thought, end quote. Further in the essay, again, two versions of the same. The first version, Harriet Jacobs cannot give the consent that nevertheless she can withhold. And in the Black and Blur version, insofar as Harriet Jacobs cannot give the consent that nevertheless she can withhold, she consents not to be a single being, end quote. These are the same lines with difference, attempting to capture something of the same. They are the flatted fifths of one another, the blue note, the turnaround that is at the same time intentioned to produce difference, or intentioned difference that is supposed to produce surprise, delight, deeper investigation, a digging in, and a reaching back. The colloquial understanding of Negro spirituals and Black gospel music that would emerge from it is that they can all be played with only the Black notes, or what Western musicology and notation calls the pentatonic scale. In jazz and the blues, the blue note is supposedly the lower than expected tone. It's an alternation of a quarter tone for a semitone. The blue note, in other words, is about registering difference, but difference that is anoriginal. So I'm changing the red for the blue. The color red will come back. Lowering the audiovisual choreosonic pitch. Red for blue marks the relation rather than the individual note. It marks plurality over and against the one, which it turns out is the thing that blue ever conceptually attempted to capture anyway. This would be a modulation, the way the musician changes from tonal center to tonal center while playing nothing music. The blues maintains a relationship and thus a mode of collective consciousness to the practice of Islam. Sylvia Diouf and others have elaborated on this concept. They talk about, for the example, the amount of enslaved people who were brought to the New World, to the Americas, who were from Muslim countries, and that the sonic evidence of that is in the way they pray and in the way we can listen to practices of Black music. If we listen to the sound of Islam, we might sense the relationship to the blues. And to attend to the Muslimness of the blues is to think about style and the production of sound. What Sylviane Diouf and others demonstrate are the ways Black Muslim inventiveness was produced in the Americas as a sonic device. This sonic device is gesture. This gesture is memory. This memory is an attempt of the same with difference. And I want to consider the relationship of the blues to gospel music to think about a kind of hiddenness that carries the content of a Black mysticism, a refusal of the individual subject as a mystic, a kind of individuation that is about the production of identity that can be claimed or renounced. And so now I want to listen to some examples to give you all a kind of cue and clue into the way there's a relationship between the sound of praying in Islam and the practice of prayer and praise in Black churches. And then I'll talk more. So this is the Ashon, which is the Islamic call to prayer. I'm just going to play a small piece of it. He's from Senegal, this person.
أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا محمد رسول الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله.
This next example is from a song called Levy Camp Holler, which was recorded by Alan Lomax at a prison in Louisiana. The Levy Camp Holler is one of the songs that musicologists use in order to try to draw up the relationship between the sound of the Ashon, the Islamic call to prayer, and the sound of the blues. So a little part of that.
Oh, Lord, I woke up this morning, man, I was feeling bad. Whoa, babe, I was feeling bad. Well, I was thinking about the good time, Lord, I once have had. Well, Lord, oh, boy, she brought my breakfast this morning, and she didn't know my name. She didn't know my name. She said, give it to the long line skin of Hain. She said, give it to the long line skinner with the brass knob hang. Oh, well, oh. Boys, if you want to go down to Mr. Charlie and don't get hurt, go down Monday morning when the boys is away.
This next example is from the Black Baptist tradition. It's called Devotion, where one person sings lines out the hymn and the congregation follows after. This is a charge to keep I have. This is an example from the Blackpentecostal tradition. Oops.
Jesus. Oh, Jesus. Come on, Zion. Jesus. Oh, Jesus. 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 Oh, Jesus. 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 Oh, Jesus. Jesus. Come on and put your hands together and say, Jesus. Everybody else say, Jesus. Come on, Zion. Oh, Jesus. Jesus.
Aretha Franklin also does it in Dr. Feelgood. There's a point.
Sometimes I get a little worried. Yes, I do. Sometimes, well, every now and then, I get a little fearful about different things. Yes, I do.
What is carried in these various traditions, in these non-traditions? What is carried is the thing that I'm interested in sort of documenting, thinking about, and working through. This last video is from a show that I did I was at the Institute of Sacred Music at Yale last year. I'm working on this Hammond book project. And as a part of the project, we did a one-day symposium about the Hammond organ, and we did a sensual event. I won't call it a concert. The sensual event for the Hammond organ. We had 2 Hammond organs in the chapel. We had 2 musicians who were playing the Hammond organ. We had people making soul food in the space because it was supposed to approach something like what a Friday church service is supposed to feel like in all of the sensual registers, not just the sound of it, but also the feel of it with the hand clapping, the foot stomping, the smell of it with the anticipation of getting out of service so you can eat. And so the experience was in order to approach something like what you experience in a Friday church service. This particular musician, Abdul Hamid Robinson Royal, grew up Pentecostal in Milwaukee and converted to Islam 20 years ago, but is one of the best church musicians I have ever heard. And so I've done this show twice, and he has been the musician for both of them. We had an additional musician for the second one. What I'm going to have him, or what I'm going to show you, is I had each of the musicians play an introduction to before we actually began the singing. The first person, she played a hymn from the Christian tradition. What Abdul Hamid decided to do, which he said was the first time he'd ever done it, was to play the Islamic call to prayer on the Hammond organ. So I'm going to play the entire thing. One of the reasons why I think this is really important, because a person like me who grew up playing the Hammond in churches often can feel like the Hammond organ belongs to the church. And so it was an interesting thing to have sounded out. Oh, I recorded it, so sorry. You're gonna hear me laughing and stuff. The audio-visual, spatiotemporal incoherence enunciates itself as the melismatic rupture on notes, the ornamentation heard with each breath of each prayer or song, the melodic structure the prayer takes, the increase in antiphony between prayer leader and congregation, the elongation of notes, the worrying of the line and of the note. This is all heard in the Islamic recitation, and in the relationship of sound to song and breath is maintained across space, time, and importantly, across religious tradition. It's not the property of any of them. And it's heard in the maintenance of the voice and the utterance that we hear across these various traditions. We might call it feeling the spirit in the dark, where darkness is the enfolding of spirit as a practice of protection and care, where darkness enfolds to practice a kind of hiddenness in the service of ongoing encounter with the otherwise in this. Sometimes musicians, there was another video that I was gonna have of the singer who's singing and she says, "Let's go to church." And when she says, "Let's go to church," the musician goes into the minor register. But I don't have that video with us. The phrase, "let's go to church," or "let's take it to church," what does it mean to take it, to have something that is worth carrying, that has been there since an original otherwise than the beginning? The phrase "take it to church" as a cue for musicians and congregations in the Black church tradition to change the register of the sound from major to minor scaling, incorporated flat fifths and arpeggios, diminished and augmented chords with voices, and on the Hammond organ, along with increases in fervor and intensity of the flesh praising. I speculatively produce other modes of "take it" to mean carrying, cultivating, conducting a kind of mysticism, a Black mysticism of and in the flesh. This carrying, this taking, is a feeling the spirit in the dark, sounded out in practices of Black Islam and in Blackpentecostalism. These are occasions to think the interrelatedness of sacred practice, of traditions as geosonic and geospatial possibilities. They are produced by dislocation and dispossession, but announce that there is something that remains even through dislocation and dispossession. The phrase "let's go to church" or "let's take it to church" then announces that there was something there before it was taken, that there was something there, that there was some form of life. This is what Made Instrument as a project seeks to think through. The blues model for us what Kamasi Washington might call harmony in and on and through difference. Another way it seems to say friendship. It is the red relationship, the carrying and furnishing forth of the relationship of sound and song to the sacred that is found in Black gospel, but is perhaps buried because of the lyricism that breaks with Islamic doctrine and theology. Perhaps this being buried, this undergrounding of the relationship between, also produces the occasion to cultivate and care for the actual practice. What is played out in Black gospel music, in other words, is the hiddenness of the blues, which would then be the hiddenness of the social and spiritual relation that the blues enunciates and announces with every taken breath. Such a hiddenness is given and withheld in sound and song, and the sonic manifestation of hiddenness is grounded in the ongoing play and dance of blackness to nothingness. What is carried is the relationship, in other words, to augmentation, or what we might say the impulse of inventional possibility to make worlds. What is heard in Black gospel music is the undercommon sound and song that infuses circumsacred practices of Islam, and it's about renunciation. The ongoingness of the sound means that we have to make an inquiry into the ways Blackness and Muslimness have been forgotten, and how this forgetfulness is what makes possible the tradition, but it's something that we also must interrogate. This means we have to refuse to think of Black gospel music and the sound that emerges from it as the perfectibility or the supersession of Islam and its call and convoking of the divine, and instead ask other kinds of questions about it. In the essay 321 Contact, Times Square Red, Samuel Delaney documents shifts in language. For example, quote, "She would not receive his letter to," instead, quote, "she would not open his letter." These collisions in rhetoric are likewise attempts to announce the same with difference, but the shift, the announcement of the same with difference, is because of the material fact of what is unspoken and what is unsaid. We run into Foucault and his declaration that there is not one but many silences, and that we have to figure out the ways that people unsay and unspeak things. And one of those unspoken things is the practice of and the cultivation of Black queerness in Black church culture and Black sacred practice. Section 3. Contact is about difference. And the thing you should learn with living with difference is how to live, that is, how to actually thrive in life, how to flourish with and in and as difference. The purpose of thinking about the construction of geosonics, about sound and location, is not about being satiated by believing that what emerges from particular spaces is somehow something to be self-congratulatory about. The purpose of difference isn't to accept the particular practice of the alternative, but to accept the fact that alternatives are all that is or all that exists. Core changes mark difference, in other words, and they are epistemological disruptions. They compel us to think about how difference can be the cause of celebration. The purpose of attending to difference between, for example, the Brooklyn sound and the Chicago sound of the playing of the Hammond organ, I'm going to say more about that right now, is to think about what it means to actually live, what it means to actually breathe and thrive and have freshness and lightness with difference, how to really accept the fact that difference is all that we have and all that we are and all that we can and must and do allow us to make worlds together. Difference not as a neoliberal diversity project of a university, but as a renunciation of Western thinking of the pure. Difference is supposed to charge our knowledge bases for what already is, what we already have, and to incite our imaginations to what is possible, that is just beyond, and thus augmentedly possible for our horizon. To think about the construction of the sound of a city, Chicago, Detroit, Brooklyn, Philadelphia, with their Hammond organ sounds, is to think about the labor that it takes to make worlds, the labor and imagination and wisdom that exists over and against the processes of exclusion, violence, and violation. To think about the processes of making, of being made, is to think about planning, development, architecture, and construction. To think about the processes of making is to think about how peoples included in the political economy through their exclusion create worlds through impossibility, pressuring the assumption regarding the distinction between the possible and the impossible. And so some directions that Made Instrument will take, but I can't talk or sort of elaborate here because I'm still in the process of doing it, are these. 1, the sounds of Chicago, Detroit, and Philadelphia will serve the purpose of considering Blackness as the practice of geosonic possibility, the vibrational movement of otherwise enfleshed in particularity, in location. Such enfleshment happens without ever exhausting the possibility for the alternative, without ever grounding practice in epistemologies of rationality and Kantian understanding. Instead, geosonic possibility is grounded in feel. The difference between how Hammond organists produce chord changes in Chicago, for example, by their use of bright and full sounds on the Hammond, lots of chording as opposed to arpeggios, heavy vibrato with the mechanics of the instrument, and approaching a big band kind of sound, as opposed to Brooklyn with their use of alternating notes and arpeggio runs that serve for bass lines. What one musician says are their quick, expanded, elaborate bass lines with an almost running feel while making use of expansive vibrato will allow for an exploration of what Denise Vieira da Silva calls difference without separability, or what I call difference without deficiency. So in other words, I'm going to be listening to a lot of Hammond musicians play the same song, but those songs, and listening to how those chord changes accrue differently according to the place in which you live. So people will say, you play with the Brooklyn sound, or you play with the Houston sound. I'm trying to document what that actually means. Part 2. Each city, Philadelphia, Chicago, Detroit, Brooklyn, is the location of a church that is known for their musicianship. As such, it is also a location with friendship networks that make possible learning, exchange, and sonic ideas, and the possibility for labor or work. Musicians find out about available gigs through their affinity networks and that make music making possible, and they gather in sanctuaries for church services, for concerts, for sheds, and for fellowshipping. In Chicago, for example, I will explore and do in Blackpentecostal Breath at the end, First Church of Deliverance and their 11 p.m. Sunday radio broadcast as one point of convergence, a place of what Sam Delaney would call contact because of the constant and ephemeral possibilities of exchange that took place in that church, and how that church served as a stop on the gay nightlife circuit in Chicago. Detroit is home to Bailey Cathedral, Church of God in Christ, a place where the very famous Clark sisters learned to perform, not just as singers, but also as organists for their churches. In Brooklyn is Institutional Church of God in Christ, known for its very famous Brooklyn sound, which is very different from almost any other kind of organ sound that you can find in the United States. And this has something to do with migrations from the Caribbean. And in Philadelphia, and they also had, Institutional had a very, very famous radio broadcast and a radio broadcast choir that recorded a lot of albums that ended up a lot of churches throughout the country began to sing. In Philadelphia, there's Ford Memorial Temple, which is a church that is very well known for its midnight musicals, another place of exchange. Excuse me. I will explore the National Convention of Gospel Choirs and Choruses, the Gospel Music Workshop of America, and even stores that sold sheet music in these particular cities, because all of these places function as sites of social, affective, and also erotic exchange. 3, each city is a location of a school that allows for the exploration, of the way public schooling played a role in the convergence of and creation of a people. So for example, in Chicago, there was Walter Henry Diet at the DuSable High School, known for training Nat King Cole, Dorothy Donegan, Dinah Washington, Steve Galloway, Richard Davis, Arthur Prycek, Johnny Griffin, Gene Ammons, Lon Freeman, Joseph Jarman, and a whole lot of other folks. My contention is that these people had to run into, in high school, folks who were church musicians, so I'm trying to figure out how to do that kind of very historical work, and I'm not a historian, so I'm trying to figure out how to do that with a kind of precision. But the school then also serves as a place of exchange, and one of the reasons why I'm interested in public schooling and music programs is because a lot of public schools don't have music programs anymore, and I think that means something very specific for the kinds of sonic exchanges that are taking place in public schools today, because churches also don't allow for a lot of experimentation in music, and schools don't have places, so I'm trying to figure out where has the music gone in these places if they're no longer in schools or in churches. 4, I want to think about the history of sound in a city, to think about geosonic possibility. One has to engage the practices of inclusion and exclusion that produce the occasion for inhabitation. Thus, I will be thinking about migration and diaspora in this project. The Chicago sound would have had to be the result of the migration from places like the Mississippi Delta, Alabama, and New Orleans, with the jazz and big band sounds being reconstituted in the new city. The Detroit sound has something to do with Motown and migrations from Alabama to this new urban epicenter. So we're thinking about political economy, labor exploitation, and exclusion practices when you think about Detroit being Motown or the Motor City with the car industry. And perhaps Brooklyn sound, with its baseline ornamentation, has something to do with the immigration of diaspora to New York from the Caribbean in the 1900s. And the Bay Area and Los Angeles sounds are results from migrations from Louisiana and Texas, but not only those places, of course. Migration happened because people were searching for jobs and opportunities, but also, very importantly, away from racial terror. To be explored then, but also I want to explore the ways migration allowed for the flourishing of sexual relations and gendered possibilities. So I did a return to Roderick Ferguson's Aberrations in Black, which I read for like my exams, and kind of read things quickly. Students, read things with fidelity, not just quickly. So I kind of read it quickly and was like, I get the point. And then I returned to it last year and I said, no, this is like, I'm not gonna cuss. It's really good. It's really like necessary. And he's doing really, really sort of transformative work. And so the way he thinks about the sort of constitution of the creation of peoples through a sexual and gendered logic is something that he's doing in Aberrations in Black that I think is really useful and something that I want to think with. And so one of the things he says is, quote, "The drag queen prostitute is a fixture of urban capitalism. Figures like her, ones that allegedly represent the socially disorganizing effects of capital, play a powerful part in past and contemporary interpretations of political economy. In those narratives, she stands for a larger Black culture as it has engaged various economic and social formations. As drag queen prostitute, she embodies the intersections of formations thought to be discrete and transparent, a confusion of that which distinguishes the heterosexual, that is the prostitute, from the homosexual, that is the drag queen, end quote. Roderick Ferguson offers this about the drag queen as a cultural icon. I want to consider the role of the Hammond musicians similarly with their movement to urban epicenters. I want to consider particularly the characterization in Black life, in Black sacred music, which I'll say more about in a second. A fifth thing that I'm trying to do in this project, to think about geosonic possibility, I will explore the ways the juridical, public health, and education converge with doctrine and theology. For example, how are concerns about Black surplus, caused by the inability to find jobs, the creation of vagrancy laws. This is work that's been done. How are vagrancy laws discussed in churches, is what I'm interested in, through doctrinal and theological language of and against idleness, sloth, and sinfulness. How are these concerns about how are the concerns about the sins of sodomy and prostitution converging with laws that attempted to create a people that could be yoked to the juridical through incarceration before the inauguration of what we today colloquially call mass incarceration? So Made Instrument begins with the failure of the New Deal because it was a response to the Great Depression, and the Great Depression dovetailed with the creation of the Hammond organ, but the New Deal failed to account for racialization and the ways Black folks were deeply impacted by political economy. The Hammond organ is the first electronic instrument to be commercially successful, and lots of churches were buying them. So I'm trying to think about all of these sort of forces, the political, the economic, that are dovetailing with the juridical, to think about the constitution of theological and doctrinal subjects. A sixth thing I want to do, how does vibration as sound and song elaborate the tensions between thought theological and thought practice? I contend that the Black church has been misunderstood when we consider it only through the epistemological horizon of the institution. I think it might be more useful to consider the Black church as a set of propositions, a space of irreducible difference to be worked in, on, out, and through, a space of irreducible antagonism. This is another way to say that the Black church might be better understood as a place where thought happens. As such, I want to expand upon Naomi Murakawa's work in the First Civil Right, Cedric Robinson's work in the Terms of Order and Black Marxism, Clyde Woods' work in Arrested Development, Hortense Spiller's work in Interstices, a small drama of words, all to say that perhaps doctrine and theology conspires with the juridical, the medical, and the educational, each in their modern liberal bourgeois subject formation strains, in order to make persons in a process of what we can consider racialism. I contend that attending to the Hammond organ doesn't mean musicians are answering the tensions, but rather musicians, if we listen to them playing nothing music, for example, perhaps we can think of them as elaborating or performing or critiquing the tension of the epistemology of questioning. They are actually playing what it means to feel like to be a question. 7, much of my difficulty with writing about queerness and the Black church, and something that I kind of hinted at in Black Pentecostal Breath through semi-fictional letters, emerged because of a desire to want to respect the boundaries of people and attempting to figure out what is the method through which one can talk about the very dense and creative and loving, but also deeply problematic Black queer relationality that is constantly infusing Black church culture. How to honor the fact that people don't want to come out, people are okay with not coming out, while at the same time they serve as a sonic foundation for a lot of the music that we are listening to, musicians, choir directors, singers, et cetera, et cetera. I couldn't figure out how to do that with the first project. And I figured out how to do it with the second project. In this project, I will include speculative fiction. Each chapter will be about a musician, a composite character that will help tell the story that are similar to what is found in the Lonely Letters and what is similar to what is found in the fictional or the semi-fictional letters in Black Pentecostal Breath. So one of the characters that I talk about in Black Pentecostal Breath is Dolores, who is a musician. She's in a relationship with A's Aunt Janice, And so she plays the music very well. People love when Dolores comes to the church because she knows how to do those chord changes. One of the things that came to me is to elaborate people like Dolores. A person that I'm presenting on next week is a person named John. I'm really trying to think about the queerness of this music, honoring the fact that queerness is one of the things that makes possible this musical tradition, and honoring people while also trying to think about boundaries and ways people are having to negotiate their doctrines and theologies. This process of fictioning came to me in earnest after the Hammond Organ Symposium, and my colleague and incredible musicologist Fredara Hadley finished her paper for the Hammond Organ Symposium by talking about the many musicians we lost to HIV and AIDS in the 1980s and the 90s. But because of HIV and AIDS and because of a silence around queerness, no one ever talked about it. So we're losing all these people, we're losing all these members of churches, we're using them for their labor, but we are never talking about the fact that they are queer unless we are trying to dismiss them. And so her presenting compelled me to say we have to actually talk about this. And this is one of the methods through which I think it is possible. I want to think with Roderick Ferguson because having returned to Operations in Black, I find the text to be useful for thinking about constructions of persons, of genres of queerness in the service of dispensing with genres of queerness. Ferguson again, quote, "If the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, and class constitute social formations within liberal capitalism, then queer of color analysis obtains its genealogy within a variety of locations," end quote. One of those locations is Black sacred music practice. My various speculative musicians in the Hammond tradition will move from place to place, carrying affective energy, carrying life, carrying theology and doctrine with them, things that they will assent to, that they will consider, that they will disregard, and that they will contend against. Perhaps the story of migration is also then a way to understand the movement of Black queer life occurring through sacred zones. Quote, "As they claim to secure national affiliation, canonical formations pressure subjects to conform to the gender and sexual ideas of the nation. In addition, they posit this conformity as the standard of ethical development. For racialized minorities, this means trying to assume gender and sexual normativity against technologies of race that locate them outside heteropatriarchal ideas," end quote. This is why I want to attend to the sound of the city, to a geosonic possibility, in order to think does this sentence make sense? Is there a way to think about the possibility of relation that does not dispense with difference, but that allows us to celebrate difference? It's another way to be against then the ideas and ideals of modern liberal subject formation, citizenship and belonging as an individual subject, precisely because what is announced in the playing of the music played out is the irreducible difference, irreducible relationship between cities, irreducible relationship between musicians, the irreducible otherwise, the sound and song of the alternative that is not given, but that is given by what is not given or what is unsaid. To be given, to live life as given, is to be made instrument. The sounds are of, from, and making relation to migration. And like a good Black Pentecostal, I return to the beginning, to Black Pentecostal breath, to think with Italo Calvino one more time. Migration, as Italo Calvino could offer, is an attempt to allow for the emergence of creative practice in the unfamiliar now of movement. He says, quote, "The more one is lost in unfamiliar quarters of distant cities, the more one understood the other cities he had crossed to arrive there, and he retraced the stages of his journey, and he came to know the port from which he had set sail, and the familiar places of his youth, and the surroundings of home, and the little square of Venice where he gambled as a child. The unfamiliar becomes the occasion for considering the familiar. Migration then is a cause for remembrance. Migration compels me to ask, what is the thing that we carry when we migrate? The sound is the posing of the question. The sound of the Hammond musician is the posing of the question of Black being, a nothing that is not negated, but a negation of that which comes after it, a negation of the renunciation of blackness, which is a renunciation of the flesh. Migration, like music, is a series of questions of existence, of black being, always as emerging. Not a series of resolutions, but questions regarding what it means to seek resolve in a restive place, in a restive way. Migration is a quest for the otherwise and the given. It is a sense perception towards the question. It is a sense of questions. It's on the way to, through, and thus against the idea of the contemplative, only insofar as the idea of the contemplative is grounded in or bound up with Greek philosophy and the nomination of sight sense as the one sense that gives precise access to knowledge about the given and the known world. Like contemplation, it is about deep thought, but unlike contemplation, it doesn't emerge from the sense of sight, but is about the fullness of sensual possibility. And like a good Black Pentecostal, I return to the math in Black Pentecostal breath, to the concept of the density of rational numbers theory, that between any two rational numbers is 1.1, 1.11, 1.111, 1.1111, etc., etc. That between any two rational numbers is a world, or are worlds, of possibility and difference. Difference that marks relation and that announces a way of life. I've been engaging in this very lovely, weird, conceptual art practice that allows me to discover something about imagination, prompted by listening to Black Pentecostal praise noise. And so one of the things that I've been doing is I listen to praise noise and praise services and praise breaks that I find on YouTube, and I take paint and I clap my hands to the rhythm of people praising in churches, and I let the paint splatter on surfaces to see what it would look like. One of the paintings that I created was this flat dimensional surface, and I wanted to imagine, what if there is depth underneath the surface? What if we can go underneath? What if we can discover the underneath, the undercommon sort of texture that makes this surface possible? Which means that there needs to be a kind of sense perception for the thing to be possible. Unfortunately, because I had to switch computers, I don't have that original image available. But what I was able to do with this original image was to imagine it or render it through a 3D project or through a 3D program in an augmented reality program called Project Arrow, which is produced through Adobe. And one of the things that I'll just play the video. This is what it looks like small. This is what the model looks like as a three-dimensional augmented reality model, but it's pretty small. I'm looking at the floor through Project Arrow, and if you look at the first image that I post on my Instagram, you'll see that it's from the painting that I created last year based on hand clapping, listening to Pentecostal music. This is supposed to be a sort of representation of that three-dimensionally. But what I can do with this is blow it up to make it even bigger so I can theoretically walk through this scene. So let me do that. This was made in my hotel room last night, by the way, y'all. I've been working on this actively. Now this is the same image, the same model, but blown up to be a much bigger scale. I want to say it's kind of like a life scale, but it's not really that. But you can see that I'm walking through it virtually. I'm walking through the red and the blue. I'm walking through it as if I were in it, which is kind of amazing. And as I look up, I can see the white structures, the blue, the turquoise structures. You can see the various structures that are around me as I actually look around through Project Arrow. If you go on my Instagram page, you'll see the original image. One more minute. Each layer is a withdrawal. Well, what's the point of this? Each layer is a withdrawal into density, a word I can't say, withdrawal. A withdrawal into the external world, It makes evident that between here and there, between now and then, are worlds of possibility. I think about migration from Mississippi to Chicago, for example, as a withdrawal into the external world, the movement into the density of social life otherwise. Each movement or street or hair salon, like Mahalia Jackson's hair salon in Chicago, or music sheet store, like the Martin and Morris Music Studio, is not just a space of gathering, but is also a space wherein one could slip into and find worlds of alternative modes of social organization. All of this is made possible through the music. And so these 3D practices that I'm trying to do are also trying to think about what can music prompt in terms of imagination, in terms of imagining the possibility for there being worlds. Because if we can imagine possibilities for other kinds of worlds, perhaps we can produce justice and equity in this world by recognizing that the normative world is a violent one that we can interrupt and disrupt. Black life is circumsacred. It is a life that is antagonistic to the division between the sacred and the secular, the holy and the profane. It's antagonistic and enacted when such a distinction is not allowed to be believed. Circumsacred names the fact of centrifugal, centripetal, which together I call centrifugative movement, as constituting a way of life. Black life is about this relation. It's about the slipping down into the possibility for social world. It is about this sociality in orbit. Because of the circumsacred, what is marked is the deep and complex relationship between what is considered to be Black religiosity and Black sociality. In this particular work, I'm trying to track the relationship between Black gospel and popular music by listening to the sound of Islam. And the project in general, then, is an attempt to touch something. It is the attempt to sense something. It is the attempt to make contact. Thank you.